First of all, welcome to Sir Peter Soulsby and Rory Palmer, who will be answering your questions this evening. First of all, let's hear from Horpatan.
My name's Hura. I'm 14 years old and a member of the Young People's Council. In the upcoming EU referendum, I'll be supporting the In campaign. As Mayor of Leicester and Deputy Mayor of Leicester, what's your message to young people who may be unsure about voting to remain in Europe, and how would you best convince them? Also, do you agree that the government has done a disservice to young people by refusing to grant votes at 16 in the EU referendum?
Sir Peter Soulsby.
When it comes to how I'll be voting, I'll certainly be voting to stay in. I think we benefit enormously from being a part of the EU, and I think that we as a city benefit enormously. And you just have to look at some of the things that we've been able to do over the last 5 years that I've been mayor in the city that just wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't had EU backing. So I most definitely, personally and for Leicester, will be voting to stay in.
Is that an official position of the City Council? Is that something the City Council as a whole would be campaigning for?
It is, and I think Rory might be able to comment on that.
Rory?
Yeah, I mean, as a council, we passed a motion a few months ago to formalise a position as a council that we feel Leicester's best interests will be served by Britain remaining in the European Union. We're not unique in doing that. Councils have done that up and down the country, interestingly, on both sides of the argument. So some councils have taken a position that they, for whatever reason, feel that their areas would be better out of the European Union. We're a democratically elected organisation. We take policy positions on anything and everything, and I think given the magnitude of this question, this referendum, I think it's absolutely reasonable the council took that position through our democratic processes, and clearly there was very strong agreement that that position should be in favour of remaining in the European Union.
From your perspective, as a young person, do you feel? I mean, why do you feel specifically engaged in the whole EU debate?
I think generally a lot of people my age don't understand the implications that they'd face by leaving the EU, and I don't think it's been explained to them enough, and I don't think young people have been engaged enough in the whole process. I think the fact that even those who can vote aren't even bothered because they don't know how deeply they could be affected by it, and I think it's just, I guess, unfair to those who can't vote, because compared to Scottish elections and other elections, like 16-year-olds can vote, and in this election they obviously can't. But to be fair, even seeing 18-year-olds who don't know why we should stay or why we should leave is surprising, and I just think that more could and should be done.
But Rory Palmer, you mentioned the idea of democracy. This is a furiously complex debate, isn't it? Whichever way you look at it, lots of people, even those that would say they are politically engaged, find the whys and wheres and ifs and buts complicated to work their way through, which raises the question, if the City Council takes a particular standpoint, does that lead to a reduction in democracy? Because there isn't that information out there. Shouldn't you actually be putting out both sides of the story?
No, I don't believe we should. I don't think people elect politicians for us then to be neutral. I think people elect politicians because we have views and we have beliefs and we have policies that we believe in and want to enact. I don't believe people elect politicians to somehow be neutral bystanders when we face these big questions. The government are taking a position, a very clear position. It's landing on our doormats this week. This is a huge question for the country. I don't believe, on both sides of the argument, whether you're in or out, people really expect politicians and democratically elected politicians to be somehow neutral bystanders in this issue.
We have a gentleman with his hand up at the back. First of all, sir, your name and where you're from.
Michael Derry from New Parks. To tell you the truth, you were elected as a councillor for the city of Leicester, so I don't see quite where your European qualification comes in. You said you were an elected person, but you were elected to the city council, not the government. And it's a personal choice from people.
Absolutely. It is, of course, a personal choice.
And you're saying that you were elected. You're quite wrong in that.
Can I just make, there is an interesting distinction here, and I'm not sure whether it's talking semantics or not, Sir Peter Soulsby, but isn't it okay for politicians, clearly, to take a viewpoint, that's why you're politicians, but for the organisation of the City Council, and this is the same argument that's being revised across the country about the government's position, shouldn't actually those organisations stand back in this?
No, I don't think I was elected to sit on the fence. I'm elected, and the councillors are elected, to do what we think is in the best interests of our city. I am very, very firmly of the opinion that remaining in Europe is in the best interests of our city. I've gave the examples earlier on. I mean, the numbers of things that we have been able to do in our city as a result of having European funding, the number of jobs that have been created, the amount of investment that's come to our city, the numbers of jobs that will be at risk, and the number of industries in Leicester that would be hit were we to leave, are things that are quite rightly of concern to your elected representatives, and I think I have a duty to speak out.
Just as a matter of interest, should we have a little bit of a show of hands as to those that wish to stay in and those that wish to stay out of the EU? So those that wish to stay in, if you're happy and comfortable, sticking your hands up, and those that wish to leave. I would say that's a bit down the middle, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
Any undecideds? Our political reporter at the end, who remains neutral in all matters, of course. Let's have our second question this evening. Christine Young. Christine, where are you?
Given that we're the 10th largest city in the UK, are we accepting enough refugees, particularly Syrians?
Sir Peter Salisbury.
Well, I think we have been very welcoming as a community, obviously of Syrian refugees most recently, but we've got a long history of welcoming people to our shores, often in very distressing circumstances. And I think that the question really is whether we as a country are doing enough and are doing the right things. And I think as a country we are not actually meeting our obligations to some people in appalling circumstances. But actually, if to bear with me, I will actually pass over to Rory, because Rory has led very, very strongly on this and has been very active in trying to make sure that we do play our part and that we do ensure that people are rescued, as it were, from the Syrian situation and made welcome here in Leicester.
Rory Palmer.
I would have liked for us to have done more and faster. The frustration we faced was slowness on the part of the government in making the arrangements for the National Resettlement Programme. From the point at which the Prime Minister agreed the 20,000 by the end of this Parliament, and we can debate whether that's an acceptable or an adequate number or not, there was then essentially radio silence from government for a number of months before the arrangements were set out, the support that local councils would get. And I think this question of what is enough is a really important question, because nobody would thank us for taking refugees and welcoming refugees to Leicester in a number that we couldn't house adequately, we couldn't provide services for adequately, and we couldn't support properly. I think nobody would thank us for doing that. So we are thinking very carefully about the sorts of numbers we feel we can accommodate in the city and support in the city. And I've got to say, it's not just about the responsibility of the council, it's about all those voluntary organisations in the city who do a fantastic job. A really important job with refugees and asylum seekers. We've also got to be mindful of what they can be expected to do as well. But we will continue to play our part as part of that National Resettlement Programme, and I'm very proud that we will be doing that.
Christine, what do you think?
Well, I think, you know, when you hear that Angela Merkel has taken on 1 million and we're taking on 20,000, what I don't personally understand is, do we as a city say how many we will accept, or does central government say this is how many you're getting? I don't understand which way it works.
So the process is sort of a bit of both, really. You know, the government clearly have a sense of how they will organise that number. As I said, there's debate about whether that 20,000 is adequate. I probably agree with you that I'm not sure it is, and I think as a country we should be looking to do more. But the government will have a sense of, you know, how they want to sort of work that out across the country. But they will talk to councils about what councils can be expected to do, given their resources, given the services, given the housing situation in their area. But I absolutely agree, as a country we should be doing more, and I think, you know, the government were dreadfully slow off the mark in responding to the refugee crisis.
Sorry, let me interrupt for a second. It's interesting you say that, though, because you've outlined there that, you know, as a city council, you need to make sure that there's the correct provision, you know, school places, housing, all that kind of stuff. On a national level, it doesn't happen in a week. You know, arguably, it could take 6 months to make sure that that's all in place. So isn't it right to take our time with that, rather than just saying, well, everybody can have their allocation and sort it out yourselves?
To a point, but at the same time, we as a council, along with many other councils up and down the country, were saying that we were ready and willing. We did have arrangements in place really quickly. We could mobilise services and housing and accommodation, and that was the point at which it just, as I said, it literally went silent on the part of the government. And I made that known to the minister responsible for this sort of a few weeks ago, and made that point to him that local government were ready and willing. But actually, it's not for, we can't manage all that programme on our own. We need central government to be doing more, to be stepping up. And I think, the British people want government to be doing that as well. I think we have a great tradition as a country of doing this.
Give me a figure then, because you've already said you've got lots of stuff sorted out. How many refugees could we take in the city?
So 3 families arrived in the city as part of the Syrian resettlement. 3 families, about 15 people, as part of the first phase of that programme. That programme will now work in phases over the course of the next 4 years, with arrival points 3 times in each of those years. And we are saying we can probably accommodate and look to accommodate a similar number of families at each of those phases.
Not
of the
many
programme.
though, is it?
We feel it's an allocation, a number that is proportionate, that is fair when we look at what other councils.
Give me an idea of a
doing.
total number of people then.
Well, it would be in the region of 45 to 50 people over each of those years for the next 4 years. But I should say, of course, and it's really important, the people arriving under the Syrian resettlement programme are not the only refugees and asylum seekers arriving in Leicester.
But of course, that's exactly the problem that the government would say that they're contending with as well. So if we're saying we can accept 150 over the next, roughly, say, over the next 2, 3, 4 years or whatever it is, that doesn't make a dent in the problem, does it?
Well, I think it does. I think it makes a tremendous difference to those families and those individuals who are given the opportunity to rebuild their lives after enduring, horrors which we can, only begin to imagine. But as I said, we have to make very careful decisions here.
Millions of people being displaced, and we're saying, as Christine pointed out, as the 10th largest city in the country, we can take 150 over 3 years.
But it will be actually more than that 150. I'm talking about the Syrian resettlement programme. As I said, there are asylum seekers and refugees arriving in Leicester by other means, via other programmes as well. And I think if you look at the totality of the number of refugees and asylum seekers in Leicester over recent years, we are probably doing far more than what you could perhaps describe as our fair share purely on a numbers game. And I sometimes regret that this does sort of come down to this sort of very sort of linear debate about numbers. It's actually much more important than that. These are people, these are families with life stories, with kids who, with lives that need rebuilding. As I said, nobody would forgive us if we sort of said we can take more people, but actually not actually look after and care and provide services for those people in an adequate and proper way.
Christine, do you think that number is the right amount?
No.
You'd take more or less?
I'd take more, because I think the extent of the crisis is so severe, and the absolute abject horrors in their own country, it's not a place that they can return to.
Give me an idea of the number that you would like, notwithstanding the logistical issues, but in principle.
Well, I don't know. I've never thought of it specifically. It just seems like a comparatively small number for the sort of city we are. And I mean, I feel very proud to be part of Leicester, because I feel that Leicester as a city is a really shining example of a rainbow city where different faith groups and ethnic groups all live side by side harmoniously. I feel that we are an excellent example to other cities.
Christine, thank you. Graham Cole, where are you, Graham? Graham's right down at the front. What's your question?
Yeah, has the Mayor got any suggestions on how the people of Hamilton can obtain a venue in which they could have social functions, considering Hamilton is growing all the time? There's 3 new developments, there's Red Row, there's Taylor Wimpey, 500 houses on each site coming along, and there's another 5,000 houses to be built in another 20 years. And we've just been left behind as regards somewhere for people to meet socially. I know there's this library, but it has got certain restrictions, and I feel that Leicester City Council has done us down in a sense of they've had 106 money from all the developers that's been building houses in this area since 89, 88. And that 106 money is not necessarily been ploughed back into Hamilton as regards functions for the local people of Hamilton. And I feel the council has really let us down. And when we question this to the various councillors, it's all a case of, well, the money's been spent in other areas. Hamilton gets this reputation of being quite affluent, but I can tell you there is some very poor families in Hamilton. And also, going back to the lady's question, she may not know this, but there are Home Office, going to your question, there is Home Office houses in Hamilton that do cater for asylum seekers. Okay. And it's a very diverse community.
Sir Peter Soulsby.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Graham, for asking the question, but also for welcoming us to Hamilton this evening. I've got to say, I mean, I do obviously have some sympathy with you. I mean, there are undoubtedly things that can be done to improve and extend the facilities that we've got here. But actually, where we are this evening, and the library next to it, are valuable facilities for the local community. And I can see some nods around the room when I say that. This is a nice hall, and it is a facility. Now, it is not of itself enough, which is why, at the moment, we are doing a thorough review of the council facilities across the whole of the city to see whether there are ways in which we can get things that are more tailored to what the communities need in the 21st century than some of the things we've inherited from the 20th century. And, for example, right over the other side of the city, you'll be aware of what we've done in the Pork Pie Library in the Saffron Lane area. There, we've actually closed some of the smaller facilities and improved and consolidated what we're able to offer in that building. And we are moving around the city, and I promise you, we're on our way to your part of the city before too long, to look at what you've already got here.
When you say before not too long...
I do talk about the next few months. I mean, we are working around. So to say, it takes some time, once we've worked with the local communities as to what they need in the 21st century, to actually deliver it.
And where does the money come from?
Well, actually, what we're seeking to do is to do things in fewer venues, but to do them better there and to provide better facilities there. So actually, this isn't about sort of spending vast amounts of new money. It's about spending the public's money better.
So some venues face the chop.
And that's exactly what's happened in some other parts of the city. And I gave the example of the Pork Pie Library, which I say many here will know, but certainly many listeners will know. And they'll know that, yes, we have closed one or two things around it, but what we've actually managed to produce there is something that is an absolute outstanding community facility. And that's come through working with local people like Graham here.
But the argument in Hamilton is because Hamilton is dynamically growing, and there seems to be no sign of that slowing down particularly, that actually more needs to be built, not closed.
Is absolutely right. And I'm particularly aware that, of course, where we are here in Hamilton, we are right near the city boundary. And this is where it's very, very important that we work with the county council and the district councils, who are just a couple of hundred yards down the road from where we are now, because, of course, that's where some major new housing development is being planned. And we've got to make sure that with them, we look not just at what you've already got at the moment, but also what we're getting out of those new developments that will serve both those new developments and the existing part of Hamilton.
Have you had definitive conversations with the county?
Yes, we're talking with them about a number of things. Actually, the top of the agenda actually is not, at the moment, the community facilities, although they're there, but actually is school provision. Because, as you can imagine, a lot of new families moving into an area is likely to put pressure on the existing schools, both in the city and out there in the county. And we're working very closely with them to make sure that we actually have those classroom spaces for those children.
Graham, I'll come back to you in a second, but there's an interesting chicken and egg situation here, isn't it? Do you build the facilities before the houses? Do you build the houses before the facilities?
It's a long-standing question, that one. And we've addressed it when we obviously have been developing here at Hamilton, but also when we're developing at Beaumont Leys, particularly. I mean, those who have been around in the city for a few decades will know that Beaumont Leys was a major area of growth in the city, and we managed to get community facilities in as it went. And that was vitally important. And that includes, of course, the schools I was talking about earlier.
And what is the principle with Section 106 money? What does happen? Does that go into a big bucket, or does it come back to the area where the planning permissions were given?
The short answer to that is it varies a lot, actually. It depends on the particular agreement. Section 106, for those who don't know, is an agreement that you make with developers for them to provide community facilities or other facilities as part of the cost of doing their development. And It does vary from development to development as to how we do it, but what it always is something that is made public and ultimately is delivered for the purposes for which it's earmarked.
Graham, what's your thoughts on those answers?
I think there's lessons to be learned in the future, especially with the developers coming in. I mean, these developers, when they build their properties, they promise the world they will have back boxes, they will have flower beds, they will have this, that and the other. And half the time it never materialises once they've got the permission to build. So I think the authority ought to be having a more overseeing view that these developers actually do what they say they're going to do, rather than it being on a pretty plan and it looking all very nice, and then when they get the go-ahead to build the properties, they sort of leave that little bit behind. So I think for the future, the council have got to take a lesson from this and say, look, we're going to build 10,000 houses, 20,000 houses, but where are the people going to meet? Where are they going to go to socialise, or just meet up as an association of some sort?
So, Peter?
Yes, I'm very sympathetic to what Graham's saying, but I was just trying to remember, because it was before my time as mayor, but I think, Graham, and I'll check it out afterwards, but I think actually the building we're sitting in is one that was provided under a Section 106 agreement. And I'm seeing a couple of nods from some people who obviously have been involved in that. So, yes, of course, you're right. You know, we need to make sure that things are delivered. But this is an example of something that was delivered.
Yeah, but of course, it's interesting what Graham makes the point there. It's often the big, and this is a fabulous and very visible building, of course, but it's actually those other bits and pieces that are great for communities, great for local amenity, like things like bat boxes, nice street lighting, nice stuff to sit on and stuff. And if the developers, they finish building and they disappear over the hill, do you go after them for that?
Yes. Yes is the short answer. And we, in fact, what we and other local authorities do is get the money up front. That's part of the agreement. And then, of course, we've got to make sure that it is actually spent on what it's intended for. And clearly, as I say, I think that the building we're sitting in is a very good example of it being spent on something very worthwhile and valuable to the local community.
And Graham, if Sir Peter Soulsby put up a social centre tomorrow, which he can't do, but in principle, what would you book it for?
I think there's all sorts of things. There's the councillors, they have meetings, they have surgeries. We're on the Residents Association. We have meetings every month. There's old people would like to meet, even if it's just playing dominoes or whatever it is, or meet for coffee and a chat. It's a social interaction. And I think these developers and the likes of the council in the past have just let this just slide, and it's not been done.
Graham, thank you very much indeed. Morgan Bates. Morgan, where are you?
As a member of your Young People's Council, I'd like to know what are the Mayor's priorities for children this year, especially in terms of mental health. In my area, in New Parks, we're going under a consultation at the minute to do with changes to services. So I give the example of Stocking Farm Youth Centre being closed and relocated to another area, which the children themselves have said they don't like. So I'd like to know, will you be increasing funding for future generations rather than pushing schools and mental health facilities such as CAMS and other facilities to breaking point, to the point where they're under-resourced and, overcrowded, because, we need to be stopping children falling through the net because there isn't enough resources and facilities for them.
Sir Peter Soulsby.
Right, well, first of all, Morgan, congratulations to you and your colleagues who recently been elected to the Young People's Council. Delighted. I think we had a record turnout, didn't we, in the election? How many was it? 10,000 young people voting, which really, coming back to the earlier question about people voting at the age of 16, it just shows that there are young people who do want to get engaged in their communities, and that turnout is amazing. So congratulations to you and your colleagues. But to answer your question, and I'm going to ask Rory perhaps to talk about some of the health things, because that really is what he leads on. But I think the first thing that it is important to say, because you were talking about youth facilities and working with young people, is that we must continue to commit ourselves to working with young people, and not to think that we can just, at our ages, decide what is best for young people themselves, which is why there has been a lot of discussion, about what is the best structure of that. And I was talking earlier on about bringing things together and using facilities better. That's got to be about youth facilities as well as about those for the rest of the community. And the other thing I just wanted to reflect on, because you're still at school, and we do have a major challenge in delivering the school places the classroom spaces that we need in the city, but also continuing the work of improving the quality of schooling in the city. We've come a tremendous way in the last 10, 15 years, and we're now, I think, outperforming many similar cities elsewhere in the country in the quality of education we provide to our young people, but we're not there yet, and I'm very much committed to making sure we are, particularly as the former teacher.
Morgan, do you feel listened to?
I do now as part of the Young People's Council and as part of the New Parks Youth Centre, but I feel there is too many children within the city who don't think they're being listened to, and as a result of that, they're becoming not a part of the society that we would like them to be part of because they don't think they're being listened to by the adults, and then that causes antisocial behaviour, things like that. So I don't think we're being listened to as much as we should do because we are the future generations. We are the people that will be making these decisions in the future, and I think we should be taken more seriously as a whole, on the whole.
I will talk about health to Rory in a second, but Sir Peter Salisbury, it seems to me that you as a senior politician have an enormous responsibility. So when somebody like Morgan gets involved, when young people get involved in politics and go through that whole issue of canvassing and getting elected and all that kind of thing, you have the most enormous responsibility to listen and act on what they say, because getting involved, it comes at a cost as a young person, because they have to stick their head above a parapet when actually most of the time they don't want to do that. So if they feel that they've not been listened to having gone through that process, then you lose them forever.
Absolutely right. And, I can speak as somebody who actually got engaged in politics pretty much in the same way as Morgan is now, at about the same age. I'm very much aware that I and my colleagues are of this generation. What we need to be doing is engaging with the people who will be the councillors and the mayor of future generations. And I'm sure that those people are amongst, some of them at least, are amongst that Young People's Council, and Morgan may indeed be one of them. But it's important that we take them seriously. It's important that we listen to them, that we talk with them, explain what we're doing, but that we hear what they say.
Rory Palmer, just pick up on this issue about particularly health for young people. As we know, adult social services absorbs an enormous amount of money. Is that at the expense of healthcare for young people?
I don't believe it's at the expense of. I think we are now, as a society, as organisations, learning more about particularly the mental health and well-being of young people than we know more about that than we've ever known before. So we now know that if you're an adult with a mental health problem, the chances are that was probably established before you were 14 years old. So that body of evidence is as big as it's ever been. So therefore it almost becomes a double scandal that not enough has been done to make sure young people have better support as young people, particularly around mental health and well-being. And Morgan asked specifically about the CAMS service, which is under real crisis, not just in Leicestershire, up and down the country. I think the role of schools is really important because, like any other health condition, when it comes to mental health and well-being, the sort of old saying that prevention is better than cure really, really does ring true. We've got to get better as a society, being mindful of our own mental health and well-being and treating it in exactly the same way as our physical health and well-being. We talk all the time about the need to get exercise, to eat healthily. Now, they're important for our physical health. They're also really important for our mental health as well. But so is things like just taking some time out for yourself, some quiet time, connecting with people, and just recognising that your mental health and well-being needs looking after in exactly the same way as our physical health and well-being. And I think if you do that from a young age, and we get our schools involved in that, and we make sure our schools are environments that young people feel safe and confident in having those conversations, I think over time we'll see a real improvement. And I think a lot of this is about confidence, and it's about our ability as a society to be able to say, when we see discrimination and stigma around mental health, that enough's enough, that's not acceptable. When we see comedians making jokes out of mental health, that's just not acceptable, and we should call that out. Because what that means is if you are a young person and you're struggling with your mental health, it probably puts you weeks and months and years backwards in being prepared to talk about that, even to your parents. So, this is a huge responsibility for society. I, as a decision maker at Leicester City Council, will do my bit and I'll fight our corner as a city. But actually, we need everyone doing their bit. We need the Young People's Council doing their bit. We need all the generations doing their bit. We need sort of iconic celebrities who can sort of set agendas around this doing their bit. We need the media to do their bit. We'll have a much better conversation on this as a society. If we don't get that right, frankly, we won't secure the change that we need to see.
We've got a hand up in the audience as well. Your name and where you're from.
Oh, Reena Patel. I'm from around the corner. Yeah, I was listening to what you were saying, and I totally agree. It's a society issue and things like that. But a lot of what you were saying was it's also about schools and so forth. Yeah. Yes, that is very true. But as it presently stands, schools already struggle. Schools struggle with education, mental health, bullying, dealing with young people as a whole. So to apply that extra pressure onto a school, I just believe that they will falter even more so. If you're talking about schools being helpful, how would you make that happen?
I mean, Rory Palmer, it's an interesting point, that, isn't it? That I don't think many people would disagree with the idea of destigmatising mental health, particularly in ensuring that young people from as early as age as possible have access to it. Saying that is one thing. Putting in the logistics and the resources for it are quite another.
Absolutely, I think it's a very important and fair point, and I understand the pressures on teachers' time and the resources of schools. I'm married to a teacher. My dad's been a teacher for 30 odd years, so believe you me, I know about the pressures that teachers face. But I think the key with this is not to make it something extra and additional, but to make it part of normality in schools, and to build it into the curriculum, to build it into the time that tutors spend with their tutor groups at registration, that daily time, to build it into as part of the PE curriculum. As I've said, looking after your physical health is good for mental health and well-being as well. It's not about making this another thing to do. It's about building it in and mainstreaming it into what schools are already doing. So I absolutely accept the point. Teachers have a lot to do. The other staff who run our schools have a lot to do. Students themselves have a hell of a lot to do. And I think actually, we think about the pressure we put on kids today around exam results and around attainment. That isn't helping. I think we've got to have a much more mature conversation about young people's mental health and well-being, about their place in society, about the pressures they feel around exams and attainment and achievement. We want our kids to do well, but I think when we see some of what we, sometimes, without being critical of any of the media here, who are always very fair about this, but we see in parts of the media really unreasonable expectations being put on kids when it's the run-up to exams, that somehow you're a failure if you don't get 10 or 12 A-star GCSEs. Well, so what? I got B's and C's in my GCSEs, and I like to think, I've done all right.
Talking as somebody that turned up to the wrong exam on the right day, I couldn't concur more strongly. Morgan, just before we move on to the next question, when you are sitting up there in a few years' time as the elected mayor of Leicester City, what's the first change you would make?
I'd like to see a hell of a lot more money ploughed into CAMS and services like that, because I have a family member who's been told she might spend 7 months on the waiting list to even get an appointment, and I just think there needs to be so much more money going into that. And I saw a statistic in one of the newspapers the other day that said that CAMS actually gets 0.7% of the whole mental health budget, and actually young people under 14 get 7% of that, and I think that's wrong, and I'd like to change that.
We have that now in our archive, so we will refer to that in 10 or 15, 20 years' time. Just before we do finish, another hand at the back.
Christina Derry from New Parks. I've got great sympathy with the lady over there that's asking the question, and the main question was to do with the cuts, and you answered her question with a really big generalisation of how people should treat these things and think about these things at school and so forth, never really answering the question about the cuts.
Well, let me answer it directly then. So when I was responsible for the council's public health budget 2 years ago, I more than doubled the amount we spend on public mental health in Leicester. I've been campaigning for years to get more investment into CAMS, which is an NHS responsibility. In fact, I've worked with the Young People's Council on that a few years ago, and I'm asked to come to meet with the Young People's Council so we can renew that campaign and make sure there is more money going into mental health services in the NHS. Now, obviously, the NHS budget is managed and run by the NHS. I've made very clear that I expect them to do more, that we want them to do more, but the health budget that the City Council controls, as I said, I more than doubled the amount that went into public mental health work 2 years ago. Now, of course, this is about politics and priorities, so I've got to trade and balance that off what we spend on cancer screening, for example, on how much we spend to support people with alcohol problems or people who want to quit smoking. So, it's all about priorities. Now, I do believe mental health well-being is a big priority, And that's why more than doubled the amount of money that was going in to that from 2 years ago. And that means that there was less money being spent on some of those other things. So, I'd like to think that I've done what I said I would do.
OK, let's move on. Ramesh Katecha, where are you?
Hello, good evening. I'm an ex-Leicester City Council employee, worked as a revenue and benefit officer on a scale 6, fraud officer and a presiding officer at local and general election. I want to ask Mr. Soulsby, when you are promoting Leicester City Council to general public, you are making a statement that Leicester City Council is committed to equality and opportunity, eliminating any discrimination of any forms, right, promoting of good relationship between all the people, regardless of their age, disability, race, ethnic or national origin, gender identity, religion, belief, sexual orientation, etc. Is it not true that you are not telling the complete truth because your council transport department operates a discriminatory policy towards British citizens who are not born in this country, but they have acquired citizenship by naturalization? I'll give you an example. Council Transport Policy Department states anybody who makes an application for license has to undergo English assessment test. All new applications must either show that they were born in the United Kingdom by providing a birth certificate or undertaking an English assessment test at Leicester College and provide ESOL certificate confirming that they can speak, read and write English. As there is no exemption on this above policy, it clearly discriminates and insults British citizens living in Leicester City area. I would like to point out that according to the Leicester Council's Census report of 2011, there are 29% of Leicester adult residents who cannot read, write or speak English, which includes those who were born in here.
The question being, the nub of the question, in one sentence?
One sentence, right? British citizenship were not born here. They acquired the citizenship, right, by naturalization, are discriminated and treated as an immigrant.
Sir Peter Soulsby.
Well, I know Ramesh's case very well because he's written to me many times over a long period of time, as he's written to a lot of councillors as well. Looked at it very, very carefully, and it's very clear to me that what the council is doing is perfectly reasonable. It is very reasonable indeed for the council to expect that taxi drivers, private hire drivers, I think he has both sorts of licence, will be able to understand and speak in English. It's our common language, and it's quite reasonable that we should expect that of those who are going to apply for hire in our streets and carry us safely to where we go.
I don't think he's suggesting that that's not reasonable. What he's suggesting
well, he
is that
actually,
why isn't everybody
I have to say,
given the same test?
I have to say, Ben, he is suggesting it's not reasonable. He has written to me many times on the issue. It has been to the Ombudsman, who agrees entirely with my view that it's a very reasonable thing for us to expect that our taxi drivers can speak and read English.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems the nub of it is not that it's not acceptable that taxi drivers should be able to speak and understand English. It's more that the test makes the discrimination.
Well, I have to say I've struggled on many occasions to understand quite what point Ramesh is making, and you had some difficulty as well understanding what point he was making this evening. But it seems to me that he is suggesting that we are somehow not even-handed in the way we apply this. I assure you we are entirely even-handed, and the Ombudsman agrees with us.
Ramesh, should everybody have the test or nobody?
No. Those who are born here, they only got to produce a birth certificate. And according to the census, it clearly states, right, 29% of the Leicester City residents, that includes those who are born here, not educated. So where does it, that's a complete discrimination.
But sorry, isn't this a question about whether taxi drivers should be able to speak and understand English?
Yeah, but
should they?
They should, right? But in the contents of putting this application, they should treat everybody equal. Whether they have got
so
right
everybody applying for a license should have the test.
Everybody should either have a test or everybody should be given. There should be an exemption. Like a person like me, I worked 12 years with the Leicester City Council, and it's insult to me. After 12 years, I've been told that I can't read, write, and speak English. When I was a benefit revenue officer.
But in fairness, of course, this test isn't just about you, is it? It's about
no,
everybody
it's not
that's
about
applying.
Me.
So you clearly can. Some people might not be able to.
Yeah, but council, right, other councils have got different policy than Leicester City Council. It's only 3 councils in the whole United Kingdom who are operating this discriminatory policy.
Okay.
Other councils, they interview the people to make sure, right, that they can read, write and speak. If they can't, then only they send it. That way, right, it can be fairer.
Okay, Ramesh, thank you. I have a feeling that there might be some more letters pinging backwards and forwards.
Yes, but the daft thing about this is, Ben, that Ramesh passed the test easily and got his licence.
Michael Barker, let's have your question.
Yeah, this year the national local government committees of two unions, Unite and Unison, passed motions calling upon Labour councils to set legal no-cuts budgets by using reserves, capitalising eligible general fund expenditure and borrowing prudentially to generate resources. So union representatives have been calling upon our city mayor to do this for years. And so I wanted to know why he's ignored this option. More than this, he's actually laughed at it in council when it was proposed last year. The setting of legal no-cuts budgets could be used to help launch a city and nationwide fight back against the Tories' hated policies of vicious cuts. And unfortunately, Sir Peter Salisbury's only response to these requests so far have been to ridicule the people who've suggested them and then to lie in the media. For example, when this was raised earlier this year, he said that the people raising these issues, these are the big unions, are actually off their trolley or something. I mean, he said as much in the newspaper.
Okay, Sir Peter Salisbury, your response to that?
Well, the straight fact is that councils up and down the land have a legal obligation to make a budget that balances. And if they don't, the so-called Section 151 officer of that council does it for them. That applies to all councils, and whether or not one is attracted to make the sort of gesture that we're being asked to make, the fact is it is not a gesture that is open to Leicester City Council or any other council.
Could you not dig into reserves?
And that's why not. Yeah, oh yes, we do dig into reserves, and that's precisely what we're doing. But that's not what we're being asked to do. What we're being asked to do in these resolutions is to make an illegal budget, and that is the road to disaster. We saw it. Do you remember the speech that Neil Kinnock made? Do you remember about Liverpool? Well, we're being asked to do what Liverpool did, and what Neil Kinnock quite rightly drew attention to was the obscenity of the council having to hire taxis to send round redundancy notices. And that's what it leads to. Having to send out redundancy notices and close down your services. Well, not only is it not legal, it's not morally right either, and I'm not prepared to do it.
When we talk on air many times about you're having to trim here, cut there, whatever it might be, you blame it on the government. Ultimately, of course, people see the cuts from the city council. So what are you doing to try to mitigate the fact that you have less money than you did before?
What Leicester City Council is facing is pretty similar to cities up and down the land, and it is a level of cuts that we haven't seen ever, not just in recent generations, but ever in local council services. We are losing from central government the best part of £150 million. And that's every year. Now, no amount of illegal budgeting and no amount of posturing and silly gestures will make that go away. That money just is not coming to Leicester, it's not there to spend. And that is the reality of the situation that we're facing up to. Now, that is requiring us to review the whole range of our services. It's requiring us to have to do some pretty difficult decision-making, but I'm not going to run away with it or pretend that it isn't necessary.
Michael Barker?
Yeah, I mean, he's made this response every single time. We made it very clear there was a lobby outside the council as well, saying that it was a legal budget we're asking
how can
for.
it be legal if it doesn't balance?
This is what the unions are demanding, a legal budget. So to say that it was an illegal budget, what we're calling for, is just plain wrong to start with.
But if that's not achievable, if the money isn't there and it would be illegal to perform a budget that doesn't balance, then there is no option.
Yeah, I mean, what we've said so far...
I wonder if I can ask him a question.
Every single Labour council across the country take all their reserves collectively and redistribute them across different Labour councils. Not a single cut would be needed to be made right now. And that's very, very important because Labour have to pose the difference to the Conservatives. Conservatives are in crisis, and we have a Labour council who've been making cuts and cuts and cuts.
Michael has made it personal to me and particular to Leicester. But a simple question to him. If it is both legal and possible, why is there not a single council in the UK that's doing it? Name one.
Well, I can tell you why not a single council's doing it. It's because you quoted Neil Kinnock, a right-wing member of the Labour Party, precisely because the Labour Party has moved so far to the right.
Name a
Jeremy
single
Corbyn
council under
was
any
elected
control in the UK
without
that
the
is doing it.
support of a single councillor in this city. That's outrageous. Not a single of the
But let me
52
just-
Labour councillors
Let me
supported
just
Jeremy
hang on,
Corbyn.
Rory, one second. But let me just dig into this a second, because there's clearly a lot of heat here. But if you pool all the resources are there for a reason. They have a legal obligation to maintain resources so that if something happens, there's money there to deal with it, a flood or whatever it might be. So if you pool all those reserves and spend them, you might be able to, although it's actually illegal to do it, but you might be able to not cut this year. What happens next year?
Yeah, it wouldn't be illegal to do it, but the point would be to build a big mass campaign. Just not making the cuts isn't a solution. What you need to do is build a big groundswell of people, just as they did in Liverpool. And in Liverpool, they did build 5,000 council houses during the 1980s, more than every single
But they went
city
bust.
in every other city
they went
in the rest of the
bust.
country. Like Peter Salisbury talked about the taxi drivers and the redundancies. He has made thousands of redundancies in this city. Unfortunately, in Liverpool, none of the redundancy notices that were sent out in taxis resulted in redundancies. Peter Salisbury couldn't even send them out in taxis because the taxis is in dispute with them because he treats the union with utter disrespect.
Let's just
as
get a
he
little
does my
show.
own
Let's just
union,
get a little
Unison.
show of hands. Let's just putting the legality of it all aside. Show of hands. Spend the reserves. Not spend the reserves. A few people not sure. Rory Palmer, I heard you were exclaiming in the background there.
Well, it's sort of not quite that simple in a sense, because of course we have to maintain some reserves for, those emergency situations, those unforeseen events, but at the same time we are using our reserves in significant quantity to sustain our services through this financial climate. Local government finance can be quite complicated and complex. I accept that. But local government finance is also incredibly simple, as the Mayor has outlined. If the money is not there in our accounts from the grants we get from government, we cannot spend it.
What are you doing to fight the cuts?
Well, what have we been doing to fight the cuts? Well, what I did last year was spend hundreds of hours trying to elect a Labour government who would have provided a much fairer settlement for local government. Unlike Mr Barker and his party, who were probably trying to do the opposite, I would challenge Mr Barker. How many doors did you knock on last year to try to elect a Labour government?
I didn't count them. I mean, maybe you can keep track of exactly how many you've knocked on, because it's so few. But I spent countless evenings doing it. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to ask.
How many? I will leave Mr Barker
how
to
many
continue
doors you knocked on
to write his silly satirical blogs about us, which do provide a little bit of amusement, despite their utter sort of unfactual and fictional basis. But look, we are going to disagree on this.
You find that I haven't written a single lie.
Hang on, Michael. Let Rory. I'll let you make the point. I'll let you make the point. Rory, just finish your point.
Look, our politics, is based in the real world as we find it, and the situations we find it, and we deal with it within the legal framework in which we have to operate based on a real and sensible understanding of the world as we find it.
Michael, you've got one sentence because I want to finish with another question.
I just wanted to point. The gentleman at the front was very right about the 106 agreements. This council does not fight to make sure they get the money. For example, when the 200-odd buildings built at Wheatsheaf, they got 0% affordable housing. In their own documents, they say they strive for 30%. And then not long afterwards, they got 20%, and now they're in an agreement with another company who have a track record of not committing to affordable housing. And they're giving away land for almost nothing at the moment.
I suspect...
Terrible.
Can I briefly just comment on that Wheatsheaf one? Has anybody seen that? It's the former co-op's factory. It is a brilliant conversion. I'm delighted that we've managed to bring that to Leicester, and I'm delighted that that former factory that was so important, the largest shoe factory in the world, has been brought back into life as a place for people to live.
Okay,
and I make no apology for that at all.
We're going to pull this question to an end because I just want to get the final one in. Tina Black. Tina, where are you?
A registered disability that impacts on learning is now becoming recognised by some schools, but is not widely known about. There's currently no help for parents to cover the cost of the specialist equipment that transforms the learning outcomes and lives of people who have the disability, which is called Erlen syndrome, and I have it. Schools are required to adhere to the Equality Act and should therefore make reasonable adjustments in line with it for funding the provision of the equipment that's required, as employers and universities already do. As a pathfinder in education, what is the City Council going to do to equalise this inequality of access to education for our children? Please.
Sir Peter Salisbury.
It is certainly the case that schools and public bodies in general have an obligation to make reasonable adjustments. I'm going to be very, very frank with you. It is not a disability about which I know very much. I've heard it mentioned, but I don't know enough about it
Tina,
to be able to give you a proper answer. Actually.
Would you be happy just telling us a little bit about Irlen syndrome?
Yeah, Irlen syndrome, it's a neurological condition, so it's based on the visual pathways of the brain. And just to kind of give the general public an idea, typically it'll impact on their learning by distortions in text. So a lot of people think it's dyslexia, when text seems to move or wobble, or you get shadows or swirls. For myself, I can't see text. I can only see about a centimetre of text clearly at one time. So I can read, but it's not very fluent.
And what would make a difference? What sort of equipment would
These
would make a
glasses
difference?
that myself and Rena, who's come with me, are wearing, just to represent the glasses wearers. The tint in the lens, a specific colour that an individual needs, filters out wavelengths of light in the environment that interfere with the visual pathway of the brain and cause overactivity. So you get physical symptoms as well.
No,
so although there's an impact on learning, there's physiological symptoms as well.
I suspect maybe if 20 years ago we might have been talking about this, and we might have been talking about dyslexia.
Yeah, dyslexia and
can
ADHD are also
and thought
crossover.
there's been a lot of movement to try to get that through actually blue-tinted glasses, computers, all that kind of thing.
Yes.
I'm very, very interested in this professionally, actually, Ben, because, before, obviously, I became an MP and then mayor, I was a special needs teacher.
Yes.
And, of course, as part of that, I've dealt with dyslexia and ADHD as part of my professional work. And, obviously, this goes beyond my personal experience. I'm very interested to hear some more about it and to make sure that we are responding appropriately to it, because I think we have got better over the years at responding to dyslexia and, helping children with special needs. We're still not all that brilliant. There's still a long way to go. But I think there's more to be done. And this clearly is a particular disorder that I think we ought to perhaps be more aware of.
I'd be interested in making you aware.
Please talk to you.
I was just going to add, obviously it does affect learning, but it also affects mental health, people with migraines, the ADHD, etc. So for myself, I was in and out of the GPs for 3 years, MRI scans, blood tests every 3 months. In the end, the doctor said the only thing they could do for me was to put me on a really high dose of amitriptyline for the rest of my life, and I would have to negotiate my working times with my employer. I could only ever really work part-time. I wouldn't be able to drive my car in the morning. I decided not to take that medication because the side effects were also suicidal feelings, so I thought, no, stay clear. Got my lenses. I haven't been back to doctors in 2 years
How much of
now.
a difference has it made?
Massive difference. I used to have constant headaches and severe headaches day in, day out. I used to go to bed with it, get up with it. I used to spend my day working on a computer at work, so it impacted my work as well, my mood. I ended up getting to the verge of being on the depression aspect because of just having chronic pain. Now I live a full life.
Can we say that that's a commitment that you, Sir Peter, will have a chat to them both and see if something can actually happen?
I say both from obviously my professional background, I'm very interested in it, but also obviously from the perspective of being mayor, I'd want us to be aware of it and be doing what we can to support.
Rory, health is a particular interest of yours. Is that something you can get involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. Be delighted to learn more and to find out what more we can do.
Sorry, I'm not used to doing this.
Well, you're doing it very well, if I
It's
may say.
definitely, when you talk about prevention in public health, so it's preventing physiological symptoms, but we're talking about prevention of psychological symptoms, mental health problems, and social symptoms, because I used to work in the prisons. I used to teach in prisons for 6 years, and in that service I noticed that a lot of the prisoners seemed to have dyslexia, because I knew about dyslexia, didn't know about Irlen syndrome, which is a syndrome at the time. And to cut the story short, I eventually did a survey, an academic survey that I discovered that if I screened everyone for Irlen syndrome that came into a particular prison in Bedfordshire, and 60% of them had a positive diagnosis. So we're talking there about people who kind of fall off the educational track at a young age, and then perhaps move into obviously it's not as simple as that. I know there's lots of factors that contribute to criminality. But yeah.
Tina, thank you. Stay behind and make sure one of the mayors
I'd
we
be
will.
very glad to do that.
talks and just make and
That's
let
why
us
we're
know.
here.
We'll
It's really important.
fix up the meet
All
and
right.
talk with you.
Excellent. Thank
Very
you.
happy.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for another of these Meet the Mayor evenings. I'm assuming that there will be more of these. Is that
Yeah,
sort
I'm
of
committed
plan?
to it. I said last time at the end, were people up for doing it again? And most people put their hands up. Would you want us to do it again? It's worth doing. Yeah, I can see hands going up all around the room. And yes, if you're up for it, we certainly are.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for coming out on this April evening. Thank you very much indeed and have a great journey home.
Thank you, Ben.
Cheers, Ben.